Welcome, everyone, to the Jewish Physicians Network's monthly Applied Medical Ethics Grand Rounds in partnership with Chemed and Torah University. We aim to make topics intersecting halacha, medicine, medical ethics, and the relevant experts in those fields accessible to Jewish healthcare professionals and to allied audiences. I want to start off with a tremendous thank you to my co-founder, Mark Gons, for planning and organizing this inaugural event. Thank you to Dr. David Friedman and the fine folks at Chemed Health and New York Medical College for providing the CME accreditation for tonight's talk. Finally, a tremendous thank you to Rabbi Dr. Reichman for agreeing to take the time to talk to us this evening. Rabbi Dr. Reichman is a professor of emergency medicine and medical ethics at Einstein College of Medicine. He received the semicha from the Riets semicha program at Yeshiva University and writes and lectures internationally to audiences the world over on topics relating to Torah and medicine. Dr. Reichman was recently appointed as the Rabbi Moshe and Tendler Chair in Jewish Medical Ethics at Yeshiva College and has many articles and works published in the fields of medical ethics, medical halacha, and the history of medical halacha. He's also recently published The Anatomy of Jewish Law, a fresh dissection of the relationship between medicine, medical history, and rabbinic literature. This evening, Dr. Reichman will delve into the attitudes and controversies surrounding organ donation from a secular and halachic perspective. Without further ado, Rabbi Reichman.
Thank you so much. This is amazing to be here and to join you all. You guys can hear me okay? The sound is good? Thumbs up? I am delighted to speak on behalf of the Jewish Physicians Network. I am such an extraordinary fan of your organization, of what you and Mark have done, and all the other extraordinarily capable people. I confess, when I was a medical student ages ago, this is something that I not only dreamed of, but I actually attempted to do in the earlier days of technology. Was not so successful. So it really is extraordinary to see the success that you have achieved with your organization, and I only see it exponentially increasing in both its numbers and its impact. So it is a distinct schus to be in any way part of it and to join you here today to discuss about one of many fascinating and complex topics in the world of medical halacha. Our topic today is the world of organ donation, and we will be talking about living organ donation, deceased or cadaveric organ donation, and new frontiers in organ donation as well. This I pulled from the website UNOS, United Network of Organ Sharing, just to give us a little perspective before we begin our talk. And it's the statistics of the past year of organ donation, including both living and cadaveric. And if you look at these statistics, you'll see that there were 2,000, in 2022, there were 21,000 plus donors, both deceased and living. There were a total of 42,000 transplants that were performed in 2022. And this number is a very important number. This is roughly, and this changes literally on a minute-by-minute basis, not only on a day-by-day basis. This is roughly the number of people in this country alone that are in need of life-saving transplants, including kidneys, livers, and hearts, etc. And these are extremely important numbers, but even more important are the following numbers. Every 10 minutes, another person is added to the transplant waiting list. And this number is the most profound number. And this is the number of people that die every single day waiting for an organ, that are not able to receive organs for a variety of reasons. That's why it's so essential for us to discuss the issues that relate to both the living organ donation and cadaveric donation. So for this evening, we're going to first discuss living organ donation, then cadaveric donation, and then very briefly at the end of our discussion, some aspects of new frontiers in organ transplantation, and we could perhaps at another time spend an entire session or two just on the halachic ramifications of these new frontiers, including donation after cardiac death, selling organs, and non-vital organ transplants. So I'd like to begin with the following case study. And this is a real case study from some years ago. And it's the story of a young girl whose name was Renata Daniel Patterson, whose relationship with her father began when she was 13 years old, and he called from prison offering her his kidney. Renata, born with only one kidney, an unhealthy one, had been on dialysis 3 times a week for 7 years and unable to go to school, stay with friends, or dream too far into the future. David Patterson had abandoned Renata when she was a baby. Quote, he called out of the blue, Renata's mother remembers, but when he turned out to be a compatible donor, all was forgiven. For 2 years, Renata lived as a healthy young girl. She received a kidney from her father, and for the first time in her life, was able to function like a regular child, a regular teenager at that stage. The problem was, because she was a teenager, she often skipped her immunosuppressive medications. As a result, her kidney, her father's kidney, began to fail. So now she needs a new kidney. Her mother is ineligible to donate because she is diabetic. Her father, who is 38, wants to give his daughter the one kidney he has left. So the question that we will consider is it halachically permissible for him to donate his first kidney? Is it halachically permissible for Mr. Patterson to donate his second kidney? And what the issues are that are involved. First of all, let us begin by discussing what organs can be donated from living human beings to other living human beings. So the list includes, people often don't think of blood as an organ. It's actually technically the largest organ in the body. But the list includes blood, bone marrow, kidneys, livers, and lung. What is the halachic analysis for the donation in these particular issues? We're not focusing here on the recipient. The recipient is in a status of pikuach nefesh for these types of organs. So we can make halachic accommodations relatively easily for someone who's in a state of pikuach nefesh and requires life-saving interventions. Here we focus on the donor and what the halachic issues are that relate to the donor. So our starting point is the pasuk, is the phrase in the Torah. It says, "Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa." Do not stand idly by as the blood of your brother is being shed. And the question we're going to discuss for the next few moments is, what are the parameters? What is the application of this particular phrase to the world of organ donation? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin says the following. Gufa minayin laroa es chavero shu tovea banar. In any Hebrew, of course, will be translated. Any sources will be translated. Gufa minayin laroa es chavero shu tovea banar. How do we know that if you happen to observe someone who is drowning in the river, ochaya goroso, or being attacked by a wild animal, olistin boinalov, or being attacked by thieves, by armed thieves, shuchayv lahatzilo, that you have a halachic obligation to save somebody whose life is in danger. So the Gemara says, Talmud lomar lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. Do not stand idly by as the blood of your brother is being shed, meaning you have an active obligation to save your fellow Jew. So the Gemara continues, V'hamehacha nafka. Is it true that we learn this obligation from this particular phrase in the Torah? Mehasma nafka, we learn it from somewhere else. Avedas gufa minayin. How do we know if someone loses something, loses their body, so to speak, that you have to restore it to them? Talmud lomar v'hashivosalo, that you have to restore it to them. And what is to restore it to them mean? So if you have an obligation to restore a lost object to somebody, all the more so you have an obligation to restore the most precious object that one possesses, which is their health. So if someone loses their health, so to speak, you have an obligation to restore that lost health to them as well. But the Gemara continues, Ime hasam, if I only learned out the law of obligation to save my fellow Jew from the laws of hashivosalo, from the laws of returning a lost object, then I would only know certain aspects of the obligation. Hani mili benafshe, aval mitrachu migar agure emolo. I would know that I have a physical, bodily obligation to save somebody, which is the obligation in restoring a lost object. So if I see a pen on the street, if I see someone left their tefillin in shul, for example, or if I see someone lost an object, so I have to pick it up and I have to try and restore that to them. Do I have to expend any money to do so. Kamash Malon. So that's why the Gemara's conclusion here is that it's a twofold obligation. It's not only a physical, bodily obligation to save somebody if you are physically capable of saving somebody, but you also have a financial obligation. The nature of that financial obligation is debated. So in order to prevent yourself from violating a negative prohibition, for example, you technically have to spend your entire fortune to do that. But if it's a positive obligation, then you'd only have to spend probably a fifth of your estate, of your financial worth, in order to fulfill that obligation. And it's a debate whether lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand idly by, is actually a positive obligation or a negative obligation. So the rabbis actually debate what that technical obligation is. But be that as it may, this twofold obligation is codified, and in the codes of Jewish law. But before we get to the actual code of Jewish law, we have an interesting deviation or a difference of opinion. So the Beit Yosef is Yosef Karo, who's the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the major code of Jewish law. In his work, he writes, Kasu Hagos Maimonios writes that in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the Yerushalmi, it says that to save someone's life, even to enter into a questionable risk to your own life, you are obligated to do so. And he says, and the reason that you have to risk your life to save somebody who's in danger is because their life is in certain danger, but the risk to you in the rescue is a suffix, is a doubtful or questionable nature of danger, and their certain risk supersedes your questionable risk. Where in the Yerushalmi this comes from, we'll perhaps leave for another time. This is the reference, and I'm happy to share the slides with anyone who's interested in sharing the slides. But what's interesting is that this same author, the Beis Yosef of Yosef Karo, when he authored his Shulchan Aruch, which was the definitive work of Jewish law and the major code which we utilize today to extrapolate contemporary medical issues, he did not adjudicate the issue in that matter, and he actually did not include that phrase that you're obligated to put yourself at a relatively high risk in order to save somebody else's life. So he did include what it said in the Gemara. It said, Haro es chavero tovei banar. This is an excerpt from the Shulchan Aruch. Haro es chavero tovei banar. If you see someone drowning in the ocean, bayam in the ocean, or thieves, or being attacked by animals, etc. So what do you have to do? Either yachal hatzilo ba'atzmo, you can physically, bodily save that individual, or you can rent or pay money for someone else to perform that rescue. And if you don't do that, if you don't do any of those things, then you have violated the lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. But he doesn't mention the nature of risk, which he mentioned in the Beis Yosef. And one of the major sources which contemporary rabbinic authorities turn to in terms of risk is the Radbaz, or David ben Zimra, in this very famous passage, upon which many discussions of organ donation are based. There's a number of responsa. This is just a small excerpt of one of the responsa. And the question that was asked of David ben Zimra, who lived in the 16th century, was one of the major rabbis in Egypt, perhaps the chief rabbi in Egypt. And he was asked, Sha'altu b'meni, Odiach hadati al mashra isa kasuv, im omar hashilton Yisrael, hanach li liktzotz ever echad she'encha meis mimenu, o amis Yisrael chavercha. It's a horrific kind of circumstance that one should never find oneself in. Fortunately, tragically, in our history, this has happened a number of times. For sure, in the mid-20th century, this kind of scenario happened, where someone, a soldier or a despot or a ruler, is standing in front of two Jews, and he says to one of them, if you don't let me amputate one of your limbs or cause some serious bodily harm to you, I'll kill the person standing next to you, Rahman al-Islam, God forbid. So the question is, what is your obligation as a Jew? On the one hand, you have an obligation of lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, to save the life of the person standing next to you. On the other hand, you have an obligation of self-preservation. How do you balance those two? So Rabbi, in his lengthy response, establishes some criteria, establishes some guidelines. And he said, if the nature of danger to you is relatively limited, then yes, you are clearly obligated to engage in that rescue. On the other hand, the other polar extreme, if the risk to you is very high, and we'll simplify, it's not actually so simple, but the possibility of you losing your own life in the course of the rescue is greater than 50%, then certainly not only should you not engage in a rescue, but it is prohibited. And he invoked this term, which is others have invoked, that if you do such a thing, you're considered a chassid shota. You're not a chassid. You're not pious. You're a pious fool, and prohibited from engaging in such a rescue. What about the big chasm between those two, where something's relatively risky, not extremely risky, but not extremely safe either? So he said, in that case, if you engage in such a rescue, tavol of bracha, tremendous bracha for you. But you're not obligated to do so. The Torah cannot obligate you to do so, because the Torah is drachel darchei noam. The Torah says the ways of pleasantness, and would never obligate someone to give up a part of their body, even if it meant theoretically saving someone else's life. So how does this apply to the world of organ donation, specifically living organ donation? So let's begin first with blood. We'll go through some of the major living transfusions and see how this applies. So just an interesting historical note. So Menachem mentioned that I have an interest in history. The very first blood transfusion has been ascribed by some historians to have been in the late 1400s, actually, and had been performed by a Jewish physician. And this is an article which was in the Annals of the History of Medicine in 1917. And it said blood is said to have been transfused by a Jewish physician named Abraham Meir de Balmus into the veins of a pope, nonetheless, Pope Innocent VIII. The blood was taken, according to the story, from the veins of 3 boys of 10 years of age, to each of whom a ducat was paid. It was introduced into the veins of the pontiff, and I love this line, and he either died or recovered, according to which version of the story that you read. In any case, I think he left the practice of medicine, so it's perhaps some indication that the Pope may not have done so well. But he actually wrote a sefer on dikduk, which was published posthumously, and he worked in the printing house of a very famous printer named Daniel Bomberg, who is the one to have printed the very first Shas, complete Shas ever printed. And we actually have a copy of David of Balmus's diploma. He graduated in the year 1492, an auspicious year, but he wasn't in Spain at that time. He was in Italy. He graduated from Naples. This is a copy of his original diploma, which still exists. And in that diploma, he was granted special rights to treat Christian patients as well as Jewish patients, which was not a foregone conclusion. Jews at that time, even if they became physicians, mostly by apprenticeship and not training like he did, they were not allowed to treat non-Jews. But returning to blood donation, the Red Baz is concerned about risk. How risky is it to give blood? So the answer is, we all know the risk is very small. This is from the national institutes that discuss the potential complications. The complications are very small, especially if you have your Stelladora or Entomans, and if you have a real significant donor for the blood drive, you might end up getting some Dunkin' Donuts. But in any case, the risk is very small. But the question is, what about obligation? So you're clearly mutter to give blood, 1,000% mutter to give blood. What about obligation? Now, obligation we talk about in the halachic world. Coercing in the secular world, as any of you clinicians will know, is not the norm and is not accepted in the world of medical ethics. But you can definitely envision a theoretical scenario where it might be possible in the world of halacha, in a theocratic universe, which doesn't exist. Here you have the blood bank, where you have people lining up with their deposits. No one yet is has come for a withdrawal. But it's interesting because blood, there's a lot of people that share the same blood type. So can you coerce someone to donate blood? So I remember when I was a kid, I found out that my blood type, that I only got an A minus on my blood type. I was very disappointed. So to give blood, you can't say that any one individual is obligated over another individual. So I have A negative, for example. There are millions of people that share A negative. So, for example, Moshe Halberstam Zatzal said, "E efshar likfos al trumas dam." These excerpts come from this whole work on blood donation called B'Domayich Chayi, a wonderful name. Coming up on Pesach, we will repeat this in the Haggadah. Omer Lach B'Domayich Chayi. But what about you have a scenario where someone has a very rare blood type? What do you do in that case? You have AB negative, and you're the only person in this small town that is AB negative, and there's someone in the operating room who had their aorta nicked by the surgeon, and if you don't contribute the blood, that person's going to die. Can halacha coerce you to do so? So the answer is maybe. And going to Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg, לכן נראה אם יש מצב של פיקוח נפש, צריכים לסוג דם נדיר שקשה להשיגו. If there's a situation of pikuach nefesh and someone needs very rare form of blood in a theocratic world, which again we don't live in, not even in the state of Israel, by the way, not even close, you might be able to obligate someone to donate blood. An interesting side point, does the source of blood matter? So is there a difference from whom the blood comes? If you receive blood, does it matter to whom you donate blood? Is there a concern about donating to Jews versus non-Jew, men and women, etc.? So the reason I share this is because some of you may have picked this up just a few years ago. There was a show called Nurses, which was on NBC. And in this particular clip, a Hasidic man, they say in this article, with the worst fake payas I've ever seen, is told that he'd need a bone grafted from a dead body inserted into his leg. And the father says, "A dead goyim leg?" Of course, wouldn't have said it that in that fashion. From anyone, an Arab, a woman, etc. So there was a huge backlash, and NBC ultimately pulled this nurses episode because of the backlash from the Orthodox Jewish community. But the question is, does anyone actually hold that there's a difference in either donating blood or receiving blood from a man or a woman or a Jew or a non-Jew? So this is an article which appeared in 2013 in one of the American Jewish newspapers. Rabbi bans Orthodox Jewish men from taking blood donated by women, non-Orthodox Jews, and non-Jews. So yes, there is a tiny minority who claims that. But rest assured that the overwhelming majority in the mainstream position, and this is just one of many poskim who share that explicitly, this is Vayoshev Moshe, say that is not in consonance with halacha at all. And a Jew can donate to non-Jew, Jew can receive from non-Jew, and there's no distinction between the two. Now, what about bone marrow and stem cell donation? So it used to be just bone marrow donation, which would require drilling a hole into the long bones or into the hip bone and extracting bone marrow, and that used to be a little riskier than blood donation. Now it's possible to donate peripheral blood stem cells, which is similar in concept to a blood donation, more like a pheresis for those of you familiar with the term. A little longer process perhaps. May require also that you take some medications to stimulate the accessibility of the stem cells in your peripheral blood. But these are both very relatively safe. And this is from the Mayo Clinic about the risks, and the risks are very small. So the question is, what does halacha say here? So there's no question. This is just one example. This is Rabbi Bleich's article in his Nesivos Halacha. No question that you're 1,000% allowed to donate bone marrow. Question is, are you obligated to donate bone marrow? So here I'll share with you two interesting approaches. So one, are you obligated to donate just for a regular bone marrow drive? So here you have an article by Rav Leo Schlesinger from Israel. He's Rav in Gilo, and he argues pretty convincingly that you might be obligated to participate. He said that you're not obligated to give an organ necessarily, like a visceral organ, but bone marrow, akin to blood, by the way, is regenerates. So that regeneration makes it less of a risk for you because whatever you donate is going to be replaced within a relatively short period of time. And he actually says that yesh lashpil l'shachnea b'chol ma she'efshar k'dei sheyitram. And you should try and impress upon people how important it is to donate. And just a comment here, with respect to blood donation, we said there are thousands, millions of people that share the same blood type. With respect to bone marrow donation, it is quite possible, and has been the case, at least practically, that if you end up being a match for someone, you might literally be the only known match for that person on the face of the earth. So the opportunity to save that person's life is really only on your shoulders. So it's the opportunity that very few people in their lifetimes ever get. So one should think long and hard before turning down such an extraordinary opportunity to potentially save the life of someone else. And the Jewish community has extraordinary organizations. One of them is Gift of Life, which has facilitated for decades bone marrow donations and stem cell donations. Just a overview of what they've accomplished. They've had over 3,000 transplants facilitated, more than 260,000 registered donors, 13,000 plus matches found, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the amount of life-saving and chesed and Kiddush Hashem that they've accomplished has been nothing short of extraordinary. We talked about coercion for blood, but let me share with you a fascinating story from Eretz Yisrael about coercion for bone marrow donation, and the story is as follows. There's a woman who signed up to be a bone marrow donor. This goes back probably 7-8 years now, I figure, maybe a little less even. And she agreed to be a donor, and she signed up to be a donor. And the way the procedure was going to happen is they've identified a recipient. They were going to irradiate the bone marrow of the recipient and then harvest the bone marrow from the donor, sort of in real time, sequentially. And it turned out that they indeed irradiated the bone marrow of the recipient. And after they irradiated the bone marrow of the recipient, the woman rescinded her consent for donation. Apparently, she'd gotten some kind of reaction from the stimulating the medication, stimulating factor that she'd gotten, and perhaps for some other peripheral reasons, it's not so clear, she rescinded her consent. Now, you in the health field all know that absent of bone marrow, in essence, with the irradiation of the bone marrow, it's a death sentence. There's no way that person's going to survive without a bone marrow transplant. So they impressed upon her, and this is in Israel, a Jewish woman. So the rabbis came to her doorstep and said, I don't know if you realize, if you don't donate your bone marrow to this person, the odds of him surviving are zero. So you really need to donate your bone marrow. You need to think long and hard about maintaining your refusal. And this is a real case. And what happened in real life is, despite the protestations of these many rabbis, the woman maintained her refusal. And in fact, the patient tragically and sadly died. So the question is, what would halacha say in that kind of scenario? Would it be possible to coerce her in a world that observes halacha? And here, if you can coerce for blood, for sure, those who say you could coerce for blood, you could certainly coerce for bone marrow. And Rabbi Bleich, for example, has said, not regarding this case specifically, but he said an adult could be compelled to cooperate in the donations of replenishable tissue because he is bound by the commandment of lo samod al dam reacha. Whereas Moshe Sternbach, in that particular case, for perhaps some peripheral reasons, and his decision may be different today, but he said you wouldn't, obviously the extraordinary chesed for to donate, but you wouldn't be able to compel her. What if this were this secular society, America, for example? Would you be able to compel her to donate? Not in a million years. Would you be able to sue her in civil court afterwards? The answer to that is a resounding yes. You can sue in civil court in this country for virtually anything. But in this particular case, you would have a very solid suit against her. Moving on to kidney donation. What does halacha say about kidney donation? Kidney donation is not replenishable. And in fact, in the early days of kidney donation, the Tzitz Eliezer Waldenberg said that it's usher to donate. We're talking back in the 60s and 70s when the risk to the donor was relatively high. However, he did add, at that time already, he said, if physicians get together and they determine that the risk is much safer, then yes, it would be permitted to do. And what is the risk today? This is from up to date February 2023. There are some risks. Don't believe it's risk-free, but even with those risks, the risk is relatively small, and people who give kidneys live long and healthy lives, thank God, and the risk to them is relatively limited. As a result, there is not a single posek alive today that I am aware of that would say it's usher to donate a kidney, and in fact, many support it. And here we gave a shout out to Gift of Life, an amazing Jewish organization. Let's give a shout out to a newer organization on the block, so to speak, who's accomplished extraordinary things in its young life. And that's the organization called Renewal, who is responsible for a shidduch organization between people who want to give kidneys and people who want to receive kidneys. I don't know what the numbers are up to now. I think it's around 900, or maybe closer to 1,000 these days, to be honest. And I'm sure some of you may know or may be part of that organization who are listening. But what they have done is nothing short of extraordinary. This really says it all. This graph is the percentage of altruistic kidney transplants attributed to Renewal. Imagine, of all altruistic transplants in the state of New York, 55% come from Renewal, and 33% in New Jersey come from Renewal. If that's not extraordinary, I don't know what is. Matnat Chaim is the equivalent organization in Israel, which also has those things. And I'll just share with you an interesting case. This is a case of a member of Knesset who needed a kidney. This whole book is about this one case. And his son found out. He came home and he told his son that he needed a kidney, and his son went to the hospital and he got himself tested. When his son came back home, his four brothers were at home, and they said, "Chaim, where you been?" He goes, "Oh, I went to test for a kidney. I'm going to be a kidney donor to Abba." He said, "What do you mean you're going to be a kidney donor to Abba? What about us? We want to be a kidney donor to Abba." And the Bechor said, I have, the firstborn said, I not only have obligations, I got rights. I get to be the kidney donor. I got a leg up, or in this case, I got a kidney up on you. So they were fighting to determine who would have the right. And they asked a great posek, which one of the brothers would have the zchus of being a kidney donor to their father. And the answer I'll leave for you guys. Perhaps at the end we'll tell you that answer. But the entire sefer was devoted to that fascinating question. In many cases, we end living organ donation. We talk about risk. The Aruch HaShulchan said with respect to risk, it's a cautionary comment. He said it's true. You got to consider the risk. He said, that a person is obligated to put himself in risk. But our Shas, the Talmud Bavli, and the Shulchan Aruch didn't say that you have to put yourself in so much risk. However, he writes, Hakol lefi ha'inyan, v'yesh lishkol ha'inyan v'feles v'lo lishmor satzma yoter midai. Because don't be such a machmir with respect to risk when it comes to saving somebody else's life. Because in essence, what goes around comes around. If you're not willing to risk for someone else, that means that someone else is not going to risk if you need it. So we see from the Baruch Hashem, Klal Yisrael, Renewal and Gift of Life show that people do risk to save their lives. And this cartoon really is a profound thought. It says, we've considered every potential risk except the risks of avoiding all risks. So that's a very profound thought, which I think is very relevant to the Aruch HaShulchan. Returning to our original case, is it permitted for Patterson to donate his first kidney? Vada, yes, 100% in a Jewish context. Could he donate his second kidney? Probably not, because that would put him in too high of a risk by himself having to go on hemodialysis. So let's spend the next part and last part of our session for the next 15 or so minutes, 20 minutes, talking about organ donation after death. Now, the issue here, so with respect to living donation, it's an issue of risk. With respect to cadaveric donation, when a person's already dead, there's no issue of risk anymore. A person's not taking any risk when they're already dead. So what are the issues involved? So the issues involved relate to desecrating the body after death, deriving benefit from the body after death, the obligation to bury after death, etc. But the prerequisite for donation is that a person be defined actually as halachically dead. And that's the major fundamental issue of organ donation, cadaveric organ donation, is the definition of death. Because in the 21st century, there's a relatively new definition, late 20th, early 21st century. People not only are diagnosed as cardiac dead, there's two types of dead patients. There's heart-beating dead patients and non-heart-beating dead patients. Heart-beating dead patients are patients who are diagnosed as being brain dead. And in fact, the majority of organ donation is harvested, cadaveric donation is harvested from people who have this unique diagnosis of brain death, which is a very small percentage of the population. So the question is, what's the story with this diagnosis? How does halacha consider or acknowledge this diagnosis? Does it accept it as death or not? And once you accept it as death, if you accept it as death, then you can begin a conversation about whether one could harvest an organ from that type of patient. But if you don't accept brain death as halachic death, then there's no way you could countenance harvesting an organ from someone who's considered brain dead. So the criteria were first put forth in 1968 by an ad hoc committee of Harvard in the JAMA article. And they included unreceptivity, no movements or breathing, no reflexes, and a flat electroencephalogram. These criteria have been reevaluated and enforced. This is from 2010, where the American Academy of Neurology revisited these criteria and found them to be valid. And originally was called the irreversible coma and became defined as an alternate definition of death. There are 25 assessments to declare a patient brain dead. Most of these assessments are all clinical assessments, determined for sorry about that, coma. You have to exclude drugs. You have to exclude the severe acid base defects. They have to have normal temperature. For those of you in emergency medicine like myself, it's as crass as it sounds. The expression that we say is they're not dead till they're warm and dead. They have to reach a certain core temperature in order for you to officially diagnose as someone as being dead, because it might be a misdiagnosis otherwise. And then there's technical aspects of the exam for those of neurologists among you to determine the absence of brainstem function. And then there's the apnea testing, which is extremely important in halacha. The apnea testing is to determine that there's no independent spontaneous respirations. That's a key factor. And conditions that mimic death include locked-in syndrome, hypothermia, as I mentioned, drug intoxication. It's a funny cartoon of a bear funeral, and the bear sits up in the coffin and he says, "For crying out loud, I was hibernating. Don't you guys ever take a pulse?" I hope you people are laughing out there, but I can't hear. And of course, you don't want to mistake coma and persistent vegetative state for brain death. Those are very, very different entities. People like Terry Schiavo had brainstem function, was not even connected to a respirator. All brain death patients whose hearts continue to beat, by definition, are on artificial respiration. Otherwise, they would have no heartbeat either. So as I mentioned, the two aspects, the one aspect of the determination of death, which is essential in the world of halacha, is the apnea test. And then there are confirmatory tests which determine that a person is dead. And those confirmatory tests basically affirm or confirm the absence of blood flow to the brain. And those can include these kinds of tests here: angiography, EEG, nuclear brain scans, transcranial Dopplers, etc. The halacha also generally mandates confirmatory imaging. And these are some dramatic images just to show you the difference. This is normal cerebral angiography where you see the blood flowing in through the cranium. Here it stops and there's no flow. I apologize if this one is a little subtle, but this is a normal PET scan, and this is a PET scan for a patient who's brain dead. And a key factor is the irreversibility. And one of the remarkable aspects is that it's confirmed in a 2010 study, is that over the decades since 1968, since the establishment of these neurological criteria, assuming the criteria were actually followed properly by well-trained neurologists, there hasn't been one single case ever of a person who regained neurological function and walked out of the hospital. Cases in the Star and the Inquirer notwithstanding. All these cases that you have ever seen, and you see them occasionally, Tel Aviv woman returns from the dead Vietnamese woman revived, toddler revived, child pronounced dead, shows vital signs. All those are in the determination of cardiac death, not in the determination of neurological death. What's important to realize is that the criteria for brain death, and this has very important halachic ramifications, despite the fact that they were set forth a number of decades ago. The practical criteria and how they are enforced is not uniform amongst all the institutions. There is no one universally accepted standard. There's no one universally and consistently applied algorithm. So it's very important to appreciate that, and any hospital can decide how they want to define death. So how is death defined in halacha? So the Torah, well, obviously includes description of many people who have died in the course of Tanakh, gives us no definition of death, however. What is interesting is there is a historical precursor to the brain death controversy of the late 20th and early 21st century, which happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that when the medical community challenged the diagnosis of death, and it forced the poskim of that generation to reassess and reevaluate how death is halachically defined. And what happened back then was the following. There was this movement, which started really in 1740 with the work by Jack Benin Winslow, as a Latin work on the uncertainty of the signs of death, where he wrote, death is certain since it is inevitable, but also uncertain since its diagnosis is sometimes fallible. And what he wrote basically is that your doctor may not be diagnosing your death correctly. So what might happen is something like this. You might be buried, put in a casket, but might still be alive. And he scared the life or death, depending on your perspective, out of the entire world, instilling this fear in all these people. And these entrepreneurs capitalized on this fear with these kinds of devices, where they would arrange a bell tower over the coffin. So you'd be buried underground in a coffin, but your body would be hooked up with a pulley system, either to the nose and to the feet, which would ring to a bell, which would be connected to a bell. So if you woke up underground, it would actually ring by the bell. Hence the expression, and this, according to some, is the real origin of this expression, "saved by the bell." It has nothing to do with the boxing "Saved by the Bell" or with the school "Saved by the Bell." This led to legislation in many countries in Europe. One of the earliest ones was in 1772 in Mecklenburg. For another time, fascinating history. The person who's responsible for bringing this to the attention of Duke of Mecklenburg was actually a non-Jewish man who was a mentor to Jewish medical students in a local medical school. And I actually have one of the dissertations of his students, and he was well-versed in Hebrew. So he had a very interesting relationship with the Jewish community, but also was to some extent adversarial with the Jewish community. In any case, it generated a massive halachic response. The entire world of poskim readdressed, or for the first time since for thousands of years, how death is to be defined, and what's important. Is it respiration? Is it heartbeat, etc.? I'm not going to go into this chapter now. This merits its own lengthy discussion. But moving into the 20th and 21st century, how do the poskim today define death? And just to give you an idea of the complexity, and of course we're only just going to mention very superficially, these are works entirely dealing with this topic. Rabbi Bleich has an entire book. Rabbi Dr. Shabtai has an entire book. This is a book of essays. This deals with entirely, you can spend many hours, days, weeks on an in-depth discussion of the definition of death. Just to share with you a couple of the fascinating sources which are marshaled, and what makes this particularly unique and interesting from a halachic perspective is that there's literally a handful of primary sources and secondary sources, and everybody utilizes the same sources to come to their conclusions. So there's one Gemara, there's one Mishnah, there's a few tshuvos in the tshuva literature, and people turn to these exact same sources to extrapolate their positions, but their positions are diametrically opposed to each other. One of the sources which is mentioned, one of the classic sources, is the Gemara in Yoma, and the Gemara in Yoma talks about the collapse of a building, and this is actually the tragic circumstance at Surfside. And the question is, you're allowed to be mechal Shabbos. Let's say, you're uncovering the rubble of the building to determine who's alive and who's not alive. You're allowed to uncover the rubble, of course, to save the life of somebody on Shabbos, but only to the point where you know for sure that the person's either alive or dead. Once it's determined that the person is no longer alive, you don't have a license to be mechal Shabbos, assuming this is a public area, Reshus HaRabim, and you can't move the stones in a Reshus HaRabim, or you can't touch them, it's muktzah. So the Gemara actually engages in a discussion about how do you know that the person's alive or dead. So it gives you two options. It says you can either check the nostrils, or you can check the chest, assumedly checking for the pulsations of the heart. This itself is a lengthy analysis of this Talmudic passage, but the Gemara concludes that kol asher nishmas ruah, and when it talks about the breath, it says kaven de badak le'ad chotma. Once you check the nostrils, you don't have to check any longer. Dichsiv, as it says in Bereshis, kol asher nishmas ruach chayim be'apav, all whose soul or spirit of life is in their nostrils, is in the nose, which means that the respiration or the breathing is identified with life. So that seems to be the conclusion. And in fact, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch here all say explicitly that if you check the nostrils you're uncovering a patient in the rubble and you haven't found any breathing, lo matzabo neshama doesn't mean soul in this case, it really means breathing, menichina so shekvar meis, you let him be because he already died. And there's many other aspects of the discussion there, but the major debate between the different players and the different approaches is whether the breathing is simply a sign of life or is it a definition of life. So some argue that the breathing is simply a sign that the heart is still functioning, and if there is breath, therefore there is heartbeat, and heartbeat is the main determinant. And there are others who argued, no, that it's really breathing is the sole definition of death. And as long as a person's breathing, they are considered alive. As long as they have no spontaneous breathing, they are not considered alive. And I apologize about the brevity of this. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards for those who have questions. But there's another very important text that deals with the definition of death. And it talks about decapitation and the conveyance of impurity. It says, Adam eino matame, this comes from the Mishnah and Olos, a person does not convey impurity until they're dead. Until the soul departs. So it says, and it gives a number of examples of people who are near death but aren't considered dead. But it says, Hutzu Roshehem, but if a person is physically decapitated, Afal Pishim Efarkasin, even though they have post-mortem movement, they are still considered tameh. They're still, like you had the guillotine in France. There are examples of people that said, after the guillotine, I'm going to stand up and walk across the stage. And they tell these stories of people who were decapitated, but the body still had memory and stood up and walked across the stage. So this reflects on movement, post-mortem movement, which is an essential part of the contemporary discussion about the definition of death. And another famous passage that's mentioned is the Chacham Tzvi. The Chacham Tzvi was asked whether a chicken without a heart is considered kosher. And he used this as an opportunity to launch into a lengthy discussion about the value of the heart, the importance of the heart for the human being as well. And he said it's impossible for anybody to live without a heart, and the heart is the primary organ. And many people quote this who support cardiac death as a requirement, as showing the halachic significance of the heart. Interesting parentheses, someone who was arguing with him was the crazy placers, Jonas and Eibeshitz, who actually had a lifelong feud with the Chacham Tzvi's son, Rav Yaakov Emden. And he argued in the Crazy Placy that maybe an animal could be born without a heart, but just with an organ that is similar to a heart, say it serves the same function as the heart. And the interesting point from our perspective is that he wrote a shaila, Kosavti shaila, lasos b'shmi sheila shekorin responsi, el kol harofim b'hala. He wrote to the medical faculty of the University of Halle in Germany, asking them about anatomy and physiology of the heart, which is fascinating that he was deferring to the best scientific information of that particular time. And the Chassam Sofer also addressed, the Chassam Sofer is another one of the major players here, and Chassam Sofer was actually addressing the issue of in the 3-day burial controversy period. And he was asked, Shiloh, whether a Kohen could go check on someone to see if he was alive or not, because they kept the body above ground because they thought the people, were still alive. So he wrote some very key phrases about the definition of death, which our poskim today turn to. And he says that they relied on the pasuk, Kol asher nishmas ruach hayim ba'apo, all those who have the breath of life in their body. And I mentioned the people, whether you support brain death today or don't support brain death today, everyone's looking at the exact same sources. So they will selectively quote sources that support their position. But he writes, for example, Zehu shir hamakubal biyadeinu me'az haisa adas Hashem legoy kadosh. So the Chassam Sofer says the definition of death is part of our Masorah from thousands of years. And he defines, he said, we have a way of defining death. And he said, Kol rucho sheba'olam, no matter what, the winds have changed, no matter what, lo yazizenu mimakom torasenu hakdosha will not move the Torah from 1 millimeter from our known existing definition of death. And he also says, how do we define someone being dead? About kol sha'achar shemutal ke'even domain, that a person is completely lifeless, ke'even domain, like a stone. The ein bo shum defika, and he has no heartbeat. And if you see he has no respiration and no heartbeat, then everyone says he's considered dead. So the thing which raises issues today is, obviously, if you extrapolate this to contemporary circumstance of brain death, the brain dead patient has a heartbeat, has heartbeat and sometimes even has some neurological movement, which is not sourced from the brain, but rather sourced from the peripheral nervous system. So does that preclude the possibility of defining someone with brain death as halachically dead or not? And the major poskim, Menachem, are you still there? I figure I'll go for like another 5 minutes, and then I can open up for questions. Is that okay? So here are some of the major players in the world of brain death definition today. Rav Moshe, as explained by his son-in-law, Rabbi Tendler, Zichrono Livracha, just passed away this past year. And it is important to emphasize here that Rav Moshe's position is, even to this very day, a matter of doubt. And there are some who claim that he didn't accept the brain death criteria, but Rabbi Tendler claims pretty emphatically, and there are many, many others who maintain that Rav Moshe is one of the great poskim who accepted brain death as halachic death. The chief rabbinate of Israel accepts brain death as halachic death. Rav Shechter, Shlita, has a very different approach to the major poskim on this issue. And Rabbi Bleich is one of those many poskim today also who do not accept the brain death criteria and consider the cardiac criteria to be essential in terms of determining death. This is the tshuva of Rav Moshe, which for those of you interested, you should go line by line through all of the tshuvas of Rav Moshe. And there are many areas which require discussion and analysis to fully understand his position. But it is generally accepted that, according to Rav Moshe, based on his interpretation of the psukim, that respiration is the determinant, independent respiration. And as long as a patient is no longer breathing independently, that person is halachically dead. How does brain death figure into Rav Moshe's halachic world? So the answer is brain death is a physiological modern way to confirm that a person has no independent respiration. If a person meets the neurological criteria of brain death, then you know with absolute certainty and irreversibly this person has no respiration, and those respirations are never coming back. So that is a very simple, few-line explanation of the sheet of Rav Moshe. This book by his son-in-law, Rabbi Tendler, Zichrono Livracha, discusses this extensively. The chief rabbinate, both in 2009, both in 5747 and in 2009, later reaffirmed and accepted the brain death criteria with many requirements that the state of Israel has to enforce, including confirmatory testing. Rabbi Bleich, as I said, does not support the brain death criteria, and this remains to this very day an intense debate. And just to conclude with 2 or 3 more slides. This debate, which rages on for the last many decades, with some people accepting brain death, and those who accept brain death could potentially allow for organ donation. Those who reject brain death can't allow for donation, and it's not because they don't want to donate. Chas v'shalom. Those who don't support brain death believe the patient's halachically alive. If the patient's halachically alive, you can't sacrifice their life to save someone else. They're just as interested in the preservation of life as those who accept brain death. It's just that they don't accept this person as halachically dead. So it just reminds me of the famous Gemara in Eruvin, talks about Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. And it says, that they fought, and the halacha, it's a elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. So we say that all these positions, both positions, are the words of the living God, so to speak. Yet the halacha is like Beis Hillel. Why is the halacha a bit like Beis Hillel? Why did Beis Hillel get this chus if they're both valid halachic opinions? So the answer is because they were accepting and appreciating of the other position. They not only learned their position, they learned the other position, and not only that, They learned the words of Beis Shammai first, and then and only then they learn their own position. So it's that kind of respect which is essential in this world of organ donation. And there is a major Jew, just like we have a gift of life and we have renewal. There's a major organization dealing with brain death and end of life issues, and that was Halachic Organ Donor Society. And that society is now is entering a new phase. Rabbi Berman has passed on the baton to Rabbi Shlomo Brody, who has rebranded the organization as Ematai, which will deal with brain death issues and end of life issues. And just the very last point, just to show you that this brain death controversy, it hasn't gone away. It's been resuscitated or resurrected, if you will, in a book that came out just last month by a British Rav, actually lives in Eretz Yisrael. His name is Rabbi Yehuda Finches, who has a very lengthy treatise recommending that the halachas of brain death be revisited in light of new medical information. And Rabbi Dr. Avram Steinberg has addressed his issues on a point-by-point basis in a very, very lengthy give and take exchange, which was published in this new work, which just came out. Some of the new frontiers include xenotransplantation. So for those of you who were, had the great pleasure of being at the Chemed conference, I know Chemed is one of the co-sponsors of this event, and Chemed is such an amazing medical center, amazing organization, and they a relative newcomer to the world of conferences in medical halacha, but they've excelled extraordinarily and have really produced some fantastic conferences, including the last one. And they had the surgeon who performed the very first pig heart transplant back in January of 22. And this is Dr. Griffith. And for those of you who had the pleasure of attending that lecture, it was really outstanding. I'm not sure if these lectures will be online. They may already be online for all I know. But if you get a chance to listen to that lecture, it was one of the most extraordinary lectures I've heard in a very long time. So it's funny, what is the Jewish perspective on organ donation? We talked about the media. So there's another famous medical show, which is called Grey's Anatomy. And in the very first season of Grey's Anatomy, there's an episode of an Orthodox Jewish woman. She's actually Balas Tshuva, and her parents are Reform, and she became Orthodox, and she needs a pig valve transplant. So she actually says, I'm not going to pull out the video. For those of you interested, I can share with you. An Orthodox woman refuses to get a porcine heart valve replacement because they want to put the pig, a non-kosher treif mammal, into my chest, into my heart, the very essence of my being. And she goes on a tantrum, saying that there's no way she's going to accept a pig heart valve. But the truth is that there's no halachic problem whatsoever on multiple levels. One is, if it's the question of pikuach nefesh, you're allowed to eat treifas mamish. You can ingest treifas for pikuach nefesh, but even if it's not pikuach nefesh, the prohibition of treif animals is oral ingestion. So getting it injected, for example, like porcine insulin for decades, we don't have it so much anymore, or porcine valves, or even a full pig heart, like Dr. Griffith successfully transplanted and lasted for 60 days, would be absolutely halachically permitted, even in a non-pikuach nefesh situation. And another frontier, so that's xenotransplants. Another frontier is non-vital organs. Which is organs we talked about, livers, kidneys, and hearts, which are all vital organs. You can't survive without any of them. But the latest frontier is transplanting organs that you could survive without, but nonetheless you can get transplanted. And we had at Chemed also, there was a hand transplant surgeon, Dr. Levine, who is one of the world's foremost hand transplant surgeons. Hands have been transplanted, faces. This is a recipient of a face transplant. Larynx has been transplanted. I always joke, what's the halacha if a man gets a larynx, a voice box transplant from a woman? and he starts to sing, is that considered kol isha or not? That's a very important, halachic shaila. And uterus transplants, transplantation of the human uterus. I mean, we live in an unbelievable age. Uterus transplants, there haven't been that many in the entire world. And yet, one of the very few first recipients has been an Orthodox Jewish woman. The Boni Olam coordinated uterus transplant in April of 2022. And I understand from Boni Olam that they have 2 or 3 more from women who are lined up to get other types of uterus transplants as well. So these are a couple of the new frontiers of organ donation. And of course, there's stem cell research, producing organs outside the body, 3D printed organs, and a whole host of other things.